Gladiator fights are probably the most famous symbol of the Roman Empire. At different times in Roman history, they were part of sacred rituals, entertainment, punishment, and even an important element of political games. Gladiators were both loved and despised. They became true idols of the common people, something like modern rock stars or famous soccer players. At the same time, they remained powerless slaves who had to fight and die for the amusement of the crowd. For more than 500 years, gladiator games were the favorite entertainment of the people of Great Rome, and only the arrival of Christianity put an end to this bloody amusement. In this episode, you will find out what gladiator fights really were, a brutal bloodbath or the most popular show business of antiquity. How did gladiators live and train, and what social status did they have? You will also learn about the history of gladiator fights in ancient Rome, their rules and traditions. My name is Semyon, and I declare the section, How Did They Live? Open. Let's begin. The history of gladiator fights from their rise to their decline. Most likely, the idea of gladiator fights, like many other things, was borrowed by the Romans from their neighbors, the Etruscans. This people had a custom of organizing fights between prisoners at the funerals of respected citizens, believing that this way the deceased received the highest honors. Some historians suggest looking for the origins of gladiator fights in ancient China, where as early as the 2nd millennium before Christ deadly games with bulls appeared. There is a hypothesis that gladiator games originated in the army and were held among prisoners captured during military campaigns. Supposedly, this was the simple way Roman soldiers entertained themselves in their leisure time. Whether that's true or not is hard to say now, but we do know for certain when gladiator fights first became a public event because there are documented records about it. The first gladiator games were held in Rome in 264, before Christ, organized by the sons of Junius Brutus Pera at his funeral. 3 pairs of fighters took part in the matches. Then there was a break that lasted almost half a century. The next games were held only in 215 before Christ at the funeral of a certain Aemilius Lepidus. They lasted for 3 days and involved 22 pairs of fighters. And the famous Scipio, together with the sons of his deceased father and uncle, organized a gladiator contest in 206 before Christ, in which hundreds of warriors fought. Among them were also volunteers who decided to demonstrate their martial skills. However, in general, among the Romans of the early Republic, gladiator fights were not particularly popular. They had enough blood and violence in the constant wars they had to participate in, so as entertainment they preferred sports competitions, theatrical performances, or horse races. The situation changed when the Roman plebs, the urban rabble, began to play a significant role in political affairs, and it was specifically for their entertainment. In 105 before Christ, gladiator fights were included among the official public spectacles, and the responsibility for organizing them was assigned to government officials. The ritual aspect of the event quietly faded into the background. Gladiator games quickly became the favorite spectacle of the Romans, not only in the capital but throughout the entire country. For example, there is a story about how the audience left a theatrical play together as soon as they learned that gladiator fights would soon begin nearby. Roman citizens even included instructions in their wills for gladiator fights to be held in their memory. These fights were organized not only in forums or theaters, but even at banquets. Roman politicians quickly realized the benefits that gladiator games brought and began investing significant amounts of money in them. For example, Caesar held lavish games where 320 pairs of fighters battled. His political opponents were terribly frightened because the games became a sure way to win the love of the electorate and succeed in elections. To at least somehow prevent bribery of voters, a law was passed at Cicero's suggestion that prohibited a candidate from organizing gladiator fights for 2 years before the elections. But this didn't help much. They simply started holding them under the pretext of memorial services for their relatives. They took a radical approach to the issue. Already during the times of the empire, private individuals were simply forbidden to organize gladiator fights. To hold them in Rome, a private person needed permission from the Senate. Now, the most luxurious games were held by the emperors, sometimes showing remarkable imagination in the process. For example, Klavny organized a Grand Naumachia, a naval gladiator battle on Lake Fucine, involving 19,000 fighters and dozens of ships. Can you imagine how much money that cost? Emperor Neron sent some senators and patricians to become gladiators, which probably pleased the common people very much, and for the first time, he also held fights between women. Domitian brought dwarf gladiators into the arena during Trajan's time. The games lasted for 123 days, and more than 10,000 fighters took part in them. Emperor Commodus personally fought in the arena, which was depicted in Ridley Scott's Oscar-winning film. With the spread of Christianity, the decline of gladiator games began. Emperor Constantine did not ban them completely, but he did a lot to limit this cruel entertainment. In 399, Honorius closed the last gladiator schools, and 5 years later, a final and absolute ban on gladiator fights followed. Gladiators, who were they? The word gladiator comes from the name of the Roman short sword, the gladius, and translates as swordsman or blade bearer. Gladiators ended up in the arena for various reasons. Most of the fighters in the arena were prisoners of war or convicted criminals, for whom performing in the arena was essentially an alternative to a death sentence. Some were sent into the arena without any training, while others were first taught the craft of the gladiator. If a convict survived for 3 years, he could be granted a pardon. There were also slaves whose former owners sold them to gladiator schools. However, a significant number of fighters were free Roman citizens who voluntarily took on the status of gladiator. These were valued the most. Usually, such a dubious profession was chosen by retired soldiers, deserters, fugitives, people from the lowest social classes, and simply thrill seekers. A volunteer had to accept the status of a slave, whose life and death were controlled by the owner for a set period of time. Before starting his gladiator career, a person would take an oath that he could be burned, bound, beaten, and executed by the sword. During excavations in Ephesus, 67 remains of gladiators from the local school were discovered. All of them belonged to young men between 20 and 30 years old, taller than average. Their bones, very strong physically, show signs of intense physical exertion. Scientists believe that some of them began to be trained in the gladiatorial craft as early as their teenage years, from 12 to 15 years old. The traces of healed wounds, including rather severe ones, indicate good medical care and high expertise. People became gladiators in hopes of gaining fame and wealth, the love of Roman aristocratic women, and the status of being a member of a special male brotherhood. And it must be said that a tough guy from the bottom of Roman society really could get rich. Although, of course, his chances of dying on the blood-soaked sand were much higher. The luckiest ones, in addition to the love of the Roman crowd, received substantial cash prizes from fans, as well as a share of the winnings. Spectators often threw jewelry and money directly into the arena for their idols, which also made up a significant portion of the famous gladiators' income. And the fighters also gave fencing lessons to those who wanted them, receiving quite a decent fee for it. Of course, there were also downsides. The status of a gladiator in Roman society was, as they say, rock bottom, because this profession was despised. I've already compared Roman gladiators to modern rock stars, but they're actually more like adult film actresses who have millions of followers on social media. But they're not allowed into respectable society, and no one is in a hurry to marry them either. Gladiators lived and trained in special schools, where they were well fed and received professional medical care. However, the rules there were quite strict. For example, in Rome there were 4 such institutions, and each school had a whole staff of employees: gymnastics and fencing teachers, armorers, doctors, overseers, cooks, and massage therapists. A novice gladiator faced exhausting daily training from morning until evening. When he had sufficiently mastered the basics of martial arts, he was assigned to specialized groups of a particular type of gladiator, depending on his abilities and physical fitness. After he began performing in the arena, the living conditions of the gladiator usually changed dramatically for the better. He was given a separate room, his health was monitored, he was allowed to go for walks in the city, and women were brought to him in case of injury. The fighters were treated by the best Roman doctors, who were famous for their excellent wound care. For example, Galen, a luminary of ancient medicine, worked at the Gladiator school. Gladiators lived much better than not only ordinary slaves, but also many free Romans. This is not surprising, because serious investments were made in them and a profit was expected. I would also like to mention the diet of gladiators. It was plentiful, although somewhat monotonous. Their diet was mainly made up of plant-based dishes, porridge, stews, beans, vegetables, and flatbreads. Thanks to this, the fighters quickly gained weight, but most likely they didn't look lean and muscular, but rather big and solid. The layer of fat served as extra protection against blows, and the trace elements found in vegetarian dishes strengthened their bones and sped up the healing of wounds. Gladiator lovers and female gladiators, the brave and handsome heroes of the arena, were true sex symbols of that era. Women simply adored them. Wealthy Roman women who wanted to spice up their sex lives would have affairs with gladiators. One night with a famous gladiator cost a decent amount of money, and a significant portion of it went to the fighter's owner. It was not uncommon for wealthy patrician women to hire gladiators as personal bodyguards. Usually, in such cases, it was assumed that the bodyguard would be close to the lady's body not only during the day, but also at night. Famous people today also have many admirers, but in ancient Rome the attitude was something more. They were truly considered the epitome of masculine strength. For example, the Romans believed that sweat, especially a gladiator's blood, was the strongest aphrodisiac. Sweat was scraped from the skin, mixed with ash and olive oil. The Romans had a strange custom of combing the bride's hair on her wedding day with a spearhead. They believed that this procedure would help the future family have healthy and brave sons. So, the ideal option was considered to be using a spear that had killed a gladiator in the arena. Apparently, in that case, the children would turn out especially healthy. The most vivid proof of the popularity of gladiators among women was the ancient graffiti discovered by scientists in Pompeii. They speak more than eloquently about the victories that gladiators achieved far from the arenas. Sometimes even empresses couldn't resist the charm of gladiators. They say that the wife of Marcus Aurelius was madly in love with one of them. When the emperor found out about this, he ordered the lover to be killed right during their intimate encounter. And so it was done. Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius and the most famous nymphomaniac in history, simply adored gladiators. Once she saved one of them from certain death in the arena, and later the man she saved became yet another of her lovers. Roman ladies not only swooned at the sight of gladiator heroes, but also tried their own strength in the arena. Scholars did not believe this for a long time, but today this fact is no longer in doubt. Female gladiators really did exist. They appeared in the arena quite late during the imperial period in the reign of Nero. According to the accounts of Cassius, Petronius, and Juvenal, women's fights were extremely popular with the Roman public, but quite rare. Since there were few female gladiators, judging by the surviving reliefs, the gladiatresses in the arena would emphasize their gender in every possible way, exposing their breasts and wearing only small symbolic loincloths. While most male gladiators were slaves, among the women who performed in the arena, there were many free women, and often they were representatives of the upper classes. At least that's what Tacitus tells us. But none of the sources mention battles between female and male gladiators. Most likely, Roman women in the arena fought only against other women. In the year 200, Emperor Septimius Severus issued a decree forbidding women from participating in gladiatorial fights. The emperor's decree was preceded by large-scale games in Rome that featured female gladiators. The types of gladiators, their weapons and equipment, depended on their specialization in the arena. And there were a great many of them. New types of fighters constantly appeared, while the old ones went out of fashion. As a rule, the weapons and equipment of gladiators copied the features of their opponent's armament. In Rome, for example, the oldest, you could say the classic type of gladiator was the Samnite, named after the people conquered by the Romans. Their equipment consisted of a large rectangular shield, a helmet with a crest and rooster feathers, a short straight sword, and a greave on the left leg. Later, the name Samnite was replaced by secutor, the pursuer, even though the appearance and equipment of the fighters remained the same. The hoplomachus was very similar to the Samnite, but the former had large round shields. The traditional opponents of the secutors were usually the retieri. They got this name from their main weapon, a net with heavy lead weights on the edges. The retiarius would throw his net to entangle his opponent and then finish him off with a trident or a dagger. He didn't have a helmet or a shield, so these fighters had to rely only on their own speed and agility. The fastest and most coordinated novices were chosen for this group. Thracian gladiators were armed with a small curved sword, greaves on both legs, a curved rectangular shield, an iron arm guard on the right arm, and a helmet with a visor full of holes that covered the entire face. These were fighters with a distinctly aggressive fighting style. In addition, there were also heavily armed myrmidolaciators who tried to catch their opponents with a lasso, velites who threw javelins in the arenas, essidarii who fought on chariots, andabatai who fought each other in closed helmets with no openings, and sagittarii who shot at their opponents with bows. There were about 20 types of gladiators in total, and we know very little about some of them. Fights in the arena took place both as paired duels and as battles between entire squads, in which up to 100 infantrymen and horsemen could participate at the same time. The participants demonstrated their skill with weapons, and tried to wear down or wound their opponent as quickly as possible to force him to beg for mercy. It often happened that neither fighter could defeat the opponent, and the fight ended in a draw. If the gladiator was wounded and could no longer continue the fight, he would raise two fingers, the middle and the index finger. In this way, he acknowledged his defeat and asked for mercy. After that, his fate was decided by the audience and the organizer of the games in Rome. The final word belonged to the emperor, and people voted using gestures. There is a common belief that a raised thumb meant life and a lowered thumb meant death. There is also another opinion. If the audience wanted the fighter to die, they simply showed an extended thumb, which symbolized the finishing sword. Shouts and wishes from the stands were also important. Many researchers believe that if the emperor wanted the fighter to be finished off, he simply touched his neck with a bent arm. The thing is, the defeated gladiator was made to kneel, and if a death sentence was given, he was finished off with a downward strike to the neck. In this case, the blade would go behind the collarbone, piercing the heart. Thus, the winner was literally shown where to strike. There is also doubt about the famous phrase, "Hail Caesar, those who are about to die salute you," which gladiators supposedly shouted before their fights. It is mentioned by only two ancient authors, and both of them describe the same famous naval battle of gladiators on Lake Fucine. It is unlikely that this greeting was traditional. It was probably used only once during a single specific event, beast hunts. Fights between people and various animals were just as popular among the Romans as gladiator duels. The scale of such events was simply enormous. Thousands of lions, tigers, leopards, bears, panthers, wild bulls, elephants, hippos, rhinos, giraffes, and monkeys died in the arenas. Once they even managed to bring white bears to the Colosseum. People fought wild animals in the arenas. Gladiators called bestiarii were trained by the famous morning school, and the training here lasted much longer than for the classic bestiarii gladiators. They were taught not only how to handle weapons, but also introduced to the habits of different animals. These were the basics of animal training, and it must be said that ancient Roman trainers achieved unprecedented heights. Bears in the amphitheaters walked on tightropes, monkeys rode on dogs, and deer pulled chariots. Bestiarii were able to kill the most dangerous beasts not only with various types of weapons, but also with their bare hands, which in fact the audience especially enjoyed. Fights between animals were also quite popular, for example between elephants and rhinoceroses, gladiator show battles, or bloody carnage. In the later periods of Roman history, gladiator fights turned into a huge business that brought fabulous profits to those involved. Training a fighter was expensive and took a lot of time, so the brutal rules were gradually softened, because killing athletes was simply unprofitable, like killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. That's why fights rarely ended in death. Of the 200 gladiators we know of from original records, only 19 died. That means their chances of survival were about 9 to 1. So, we can conclude that at a certain point, gladiator fights became something similar to a sport. Brutal, bloody, but still a sport. Interestingly, gladiators were only rivals in the arena. Outside of it, they formed a brotherhood. Members of such communities supported each other, took care of proper burials for the fallen, compensation and their families. I'm sure that the injured and sick received small pensions. Yes, it's kind of like an ancient Roman labor union. Well, after finishing their careers, the fighters themselves often became mentors in gladiator schools or worked as bodyguards. They say that some of them also made pretty good hired assassins. Gladiator fights are undoubtedly one of the most striking chapters in the history of ancient Rome, so it's no surprise that they still attract huge interest today. Many people call them barbaric. Yes, of course, it's brutality, to kill people just for entertainment. But we're talking about an era when people had a much simpler attitude toward death, and violence was a common occurrence. Even today, in our age of humanism, violent sports are extremely popular. Most likely it's about human nature itself, as people tend to enjoy such spectacles. That's all from me. Goodbye, everyone.